Hey there. I've got 8 things that I never do in podcasting, and you shouldn't either. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Legit Podcast Pro podcast, where we dive into the essentials of podcasting success minus the fluff. I'm your host, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and today we're talking about 8 things I never do in podcasts and that you shouldn't either. These are crucial tips to keep your podcast professional, engaging, legally sound, and profitable. So let's just get started. Let's just do that by jumping into number 1, the first thing I never do in podcasts, and that is use copyrighted music or other material. Now, this might sound like a no-brainer, but it's actually astonishing how many podcasters really kind of overlook or ignore this. Using copyrighted material without proper licensing can land you in hot water faster than you can say cease and desist. Always opt for royalty-free music or get the appropriate licenses for the tunes that you want to use in your show. Trust me, the legal battle over a catchy intro jingle is just not worth it. Now, there are countless cases where podcasters have ignored this advice and ended up with hefty damage awards, attorney's fees, lots of stress, not to mention the shame and embarrassment of having episode takedowns, copyright strikes, and in one case, a show actually was forced into bankruptcy and out of business. And if you have sponsors that expect your episodes to stay live, they're going to be pretty unhappy if you're getting strikes and takedowns and things, and episodes have to be removed. So the bottom line here is protect your podcast and your peace of mind by playing it safe when it comes to copyrighted material. Either get permission or leave it out. And no, it really probably isn't fair use, really. But that's a subject for another episode I'll do soon. The second thing I never do in podcasts is talk trash about people without proof that what I'm saying is true. Gossip can be juicy, but in podcasting, it can be a recipe for disaster. Publishing reputational damaging statements about someone without solid evidence that they are true statements can lead to defamation claims. In podcasting, because we're involved technology and mass media kinds of tools, it's going to be called libel. Slander is the spoken word version of defamation, libel the technologically enhanced version. Always stick to verified facts and maintain a respectful tone, even when you're talking about controversial topics and people, however unsavory they may seem to you. Good journalism practices really are the best approach here. That means that for every fact, you have 2 or more corroborating sources, reliable sources. And it's about keeping your integrity intact and avoiding unnecessary accusations, threats, legal battles, and money damage awards. More than one podcast has been sued over this kind of thing, and ultimately, in one case I worked on, their network was sued also, and the network ended up settling for millions of dollars, and then they stuck the creators with the bill. That's what that indemnification clause in the contract is all about, and that led the podcaster to end the show. But that didn't get them off the hook. They will still be paying off that settlement for years. So don't let that be you. Now, the third thing I never do in podcasts is waste time on a long intro. Listeners tune in for your content, not a novel-length introduction. This shows a good example. I do a very short 1 or 2 sentence cold open, and then I follow it up with a very short 10 seconds or less of intro music and graphics, and then I get right to the subject. So keep your intros brief and to the point. Get to the meat of your episode quickly to keep your audience engaged. A short, snappy intro sets the right pace and keeps your listeners engaged and hooked from the get-go. For example, compare a podcast that spends 5 or 10 minutes talking about their day versus one that dives right into the topic in the first 30 seconds or so. Which one are you going to stick around for? And the same goes for front-loading your show with ads and calls to action. I've seen shows start to succeed. They've grown a big audience, and then that's when they bring in the ads. 3, 5, or even more, 7 or 8 minutes sometimes of commercials before they ever get to the subject matter that they're really there to talk about. And then they wonder, what happened to the audience? Where'd they go? They tuned out. They unsubscribed. Well, if you just get to the substance right out of the gate, give the audience what they want, there will be time for the rest of that stuff a little bit later on. Now, the fourth thing I never like to do in podcasts is worry too much about like filler words. We all use them, and while it's good to minimize filler words, don't stress too much over them. Authenticity often includes a few ums and ahs. It's the way we speak naturally. Focus more on the value of your content rather than achieving perfect speech. Your audience is here for your insights, not a polished speech. I've heard from lots of listeners that they actually appreciate the natural flow of conversation, filler words and all, because it feels more genuine. Now, obviously, don't let things get out of control, get out of hand. If you use lots of these words, do try to change that behavior. Listening back to your episodes can really help you identify your crutch words, and practice, by which I mean a dry run rehearsal of your show content, will help you avoid overusing those crutch words. I'm not saying pre-script your content if you're not inclined to do that, but running through your outline and your show notes a few times before you hit record or go live, and practice saying it out loud, asking questions out loud, whatever, that will make a big difference, because when the words come off your tongue in the performance, it won't be the first time. It'll have been a little rehearsed, a little practiced. Now, the fifth thing I try never to do in my podcasts is refer to visuals. Podcasts are an auditory medium. Referring to visuals that might be on screen, if you're doing video, they can leave your audience confused and disengaged. Now, if you have to mention something visual, you need to do what you can do, describe it in detail, or provide links in the show notes so people can go back and look for it later. This will ensure that everyone can follow along without missing a beat. I once listened to a podcast where the host kept saying, "Oh, look at this," without any real description. Very frustrating. It made me tune out. Avoid that pitfall by being descriptive and inclusive. And this is true even if you are making a video podcast, because many in your audience are going to be multitasking while they consume your show. And having to stop and look at the screen from time to time, well, that just may not be very ideal for them, and they too may tune out. Now, I know this is contrary to what filmmakers' mantra is. It's the show them, don't tell them message. And this is really where the difference between the various kinds of media really comes into play. So you have to decide, what kind of content am I making? Is it a podcast or is it a video? And it can be a podcast with video, or it could be a video with an audio, stripped down audio version. But the point is that you decide who your audience is and what they want and need, and give it to them in the form that is most tailored and suited to them. And after all, you can always ask them, what kind of content do they really prefer? And then just be sure that's what you're giving them. Now, the sixth thing I never do in my podcasts is dwell on the analytics. While it is important to keep an eye on your podcast's performance, obsessing over the analytics is really kind of counterproductive. Focus on creating great content and connecting with your audience. The numbers will follow. Use your analytics as a tool, but don't let them be a stress point. I had a friend who spent more time analyzing her stats than producing episodes, and she lost sight of the content quality, and then the listenership dropped, and eventually they got so wrapped up in the numbers that it stopped being fun for her, and she gave up, pod faded. So keep your priorities straight. What's really important is that you create content that you enjoy making for your audience and that they enjoy consuming. I've always thought it's better to think more about your existing audience first, then look at ways of attracting new viewers or listeners. But your audience and their word of mouth is going to be huge for that. So make good stuff and put it out there, and ask your audience to share it. That's the best thing. Now, the seventh thing I never do in podcasts is rely on independent contractors for my show without some kind of a written agreement. This really is a big one, folks. Always, and I do mean always, have a written agreement with your contractors. This will protect both of the parties, and it ensures clarity on the expectations, deliverables, and payments. Verbal agreements can lead to misunderstandings and potential legal issues. There's one case where a podcaster client of mine didn't have a written contract with their co-host, and sure enough, when it came time for them to part company, a dispute arose, and it was a long, costly battle and a real nightmare to resolve. And it all could have been saved with save them a lot of grief with a simple written contract. I call this kind of thing a podcast prenup, and it comes in various different forms depending on who you're dealing with. But I created a free guide that you can use to ask the right questions and have the conversations with your team members. If you head on over to podcastprenup.com and give me your email address, I will send over that free podcast prenup planning guide. And I've got a store where I've created a bunch of custom drafted legal document templates and forms specifically for podcasters' needs. And it's over at podcastlawforms.com. That's podcastlawforms.com. Now, the eighth thing I never do in podcasts is name a show without running a search. Before you get too attached to a podcast name, do your homework. Run a thorough search to ensure that the name isn't already being used for a similar or competing product. This avoids potential trademark kinds of disputes, and it helps you establish a unique, distinctive brand identity from the very start. Recently, last week, I helped a podcaster who had fallen in love with a show title, adopted it, started using it in episodes, only to receive a cease and desist letter after she was a couple of years in, because that other podcast, they had a registered trademark. And so I had to advise my client to rebrand entirely, and that cost her precious momentum. So don't let this happen to you. Do a comprehensive search before you finalize your title, and then protect yourself. Once you've chosen the title, consider registering your trademark. And I'll be doing an episode soon where I share some strategies and approaches to doing that preliminary level search and what's involved in trademarks. I help a lot of clients with this kind of thing, and I also have a free podcaster's guide to trademarks over at podcasttrademark.com. That's 2 T's in the middle there, podcasttrademark.com. And there you have it. Those are the 8 things that I never do in podcasts. Keeping these tips in mind will help you maintain a professional, engaging, and legally sound podcast. So thanks for listening to the Legit Podcast Pro Show. And stick around until next time. Be sure to check back in. And don't forget to subscribe and rate and leave me a review. And remember, if you need more in-depth guidance, check out my Easy Legal for Podcasters program, where we dive deep into these topics and more. Oh, and coming up very soon, I'm going to be doing my free workshop called Podcast Growth and Profit, Avoiding Common Mistakes and Getting the Fundamentals Right. So you can go to event.podcastlaw.net and learn more about that. So that's it for this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. Thanks again. This is Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. And I'll see you again really soon. Keep on podcasting.